struggled to retain their identity. The process of slavery. Remember the process of slavery that Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz talked about. The process of slavery whereby slaves were taken out of the United States and taken to the Caribbean to be broken, to be made into slaves. Al-Hajj Malik talks about it in his Malcolm X on Afro-American history. He talked about the slave breaking process, the seasoning process that was done in the Caribbean, and then the slaves were taken on up to the United States. So he talked about the process that the slaves had undergone. So for the Muslim slaves, brothers and sisters, for the Muslim slaves, and we have to keep harping on the Caribbean. The Caribbean has played a major role, brothers and sisters, in the history of African Americans, Muslims and non-Muslims. The Caribbean has played a major role. A major role. Why? Because when many of those slaves came to the Caribbean, brought to the Caribbean for seasoning, and some of those slaves, of course, were kept in the Caribbean, what began to happen? They began to outnumber their slave master. The slaveholders were eventually outnumbered. So in Trinidad and Jamaica, all throughout the Caribbean, Haiti especially, after a while, they were bringing in so many slaves, the slaves now outnumbered the slaveholders. So one of the things that you will see in our history is that the African Muslims, particularly, who came from the Caribbean, it was much more militant. It was much more militant. One reason, they were in the majority. They were in the majority. Another reason, particularly in the 1800s, that many of the slaves who came over in the Caribbean, particularly to the Caribbean, remember what was happening in the early 1800s, late 1700s on the African continent in West Africa. What was taking place in West Africa in the late 1700s, early 1800s? The revolution of Uthman Dan Fodio. The Islamic revolution of Uthman Dan Fodio. The Sokoto Caliphate was established in 1803. 1803 it was established. The Sokoto Caliphate. Some of the Muslims who fought in those battles were taken as slaves. And those Muslims were taken to the Caribbean. It's a fact. It's a fact. So as we'll get into when we deal with resistance and revolts and returns to Africa, that one of the reasons why many of these revolts were led by Muslims was because in many cases these Muslims had experienced Islamic revolution over on the west coast of Africa. We'll get to that in a minute, inshallah. The Muslims in America's, brothers and sisters, the United States and throughout, immediately formed themselves into close-knit communities. Immediately formed themselves into communities. One of the things that was a benefit for the Muslims was that they had a language that united them. Although many of the Muslims came from different tribes. You may have been Wolof or Fulani or Mandinka, and their tribal language may have been different, but there's one language that united them, and that was the Arabic. That was the Arabic. And the Arabic, brothers and sisters, was used. The Arabic was used. The Arabic was used not only in conversation, but the Arabic was also used when we get into the resistance and revolt as like to give messages, to give secret messages. And there were instances in which Muslim slaves who were caught with Arabic, paper with Arabic written on it, were immediately put in jail. Because it was automatically assumed by the slaveholder that message that's a war plan in there. That's a war plan. So the Muslims immediately formed communities. When they got to a plantation, and if they saw that there were other Muslims on that particular plantation, they would form communities. And they would distinguish themselves. And this is important. One European said that the Muslim slaves, the Muslim Africans, were more united among themselves than the other nations. So the slaveholders noticed that those slaves who were Muslims, they were more united. They were more united. And then we want to look at some of the aspects of the slave process. Dress code, names and identity, dietary rules, and a couple other points. The slaves were dressed in a way that was designed to humiliate them. More often than not, the clothes were ugly, they were coarse, and the clothes were scarce.